Hi folks, Michael here. The Emancipation Proclamation. Is that the way you say it? Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation. It freed all the slaves. It freed all the slaves. Did it free all the slaves? No, it didn't free all the slaves. Or did it? We're going to find out today. And what does it have to do with our newest national holiday, Juneteenth, which was when the Emancipation Proclamation was read for the last time in battle, well, it was after the battle was over, on June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas, saying that the slaves were now free. Anyone enslaved was now free. Texas, with your 250,000 slaves there, they're now free. And they were, because the Union Army was down there enforcing it. And the war was over anyway by that time. The Civil War, America's Civil War. And it was a bloody war, and it went on for 4 long years. And Abraham Lincoln didn't start off this war thinking the slaves were going to be freed. That was not his purpose for the war at all. When he came into office in 1861, he just wanted the United States to remain the United States, free states and slave states, just no longer having slave states added to the Union when we are going west. Any new states, he said, as the first Republican, were now all going to be free. And the South was not going to have it. So 7 states, by the time of his inauguration in March, not January like today, he said, look, South, yeah, I know 7 of you have seceded, but come back. We're not here to get rid of your slaves. And he wasn't. 4 more states would join the secessionists, and there would be 11 Confederate states with their own president, Jefferson Davis. And they were not coming back, including Virginia. And that would be important because Robert E. Lee, a great general for the Confederacy, was from Virginia, and he said that he was fighting for the South because he was fighting for his state, Virginia. And also Stonewall Jackson, who he called his right-hand man, was a great general for them. And this was not going to be an easy war for the North. Lincoln thought at the beginning that it would be. That, oh, we'll just beat them in a few battles and they'll come back. Yeah, but they didn't beat them in a few battles at the beginning. Especially at the Battle of Bull Run, the first big battle in Virginia. And it was like a stalemate. There was battle after battle after battle, and the Union would win here, the South would win here, the Union would win, the South would win. Yeah, the Union was doing pretty well, especially going into 1862 on the Western side, but not so much against Lee's forces, with Stonewall Jackson helping them and other generals. So it was like a tie, and Abraham Lincoln was not winning this thing, or at least didn't look like he was. So this idea of having a limited war where he was just doing this to preserve the Union might not be good enough. It might take something else. He would need an extra advantage. And he also had the problem of foreign countries like Britain and France were looking and sympathizing with the Southern cause, because they were saying they just wanted their freedom from the North. We just want our own country. We're having our own independence here. Sort of like in the American Revolution. But what the Emancipation Proclamation would do on New Year's in 1863 was that it would change what the war was all about. It would actually expand it. It would make it bigger. It would change the war from just preserving the Union to also freeing the slaves. So this was going to be a war that was now total war. Because if you're going to free the slaves, the South is going to fight even harder, or at least that was the theory. Because that was the theory of the war anyway, right? Why did the South secede? Because Lincoln said, well, you're going to have less political influence in our system because any new states are going to be free states. So you'll really never have the presidency again, South, and you'll never have a majority in Congress because the majority of the states from that time forward, any new states, are going to be free states, and they were not going to accept not having equal input into the government. So, but not all, and this was a problem for Lincoln, not all of the states that stayed in the Union were free states. Some of them we call border states, but they stayed loyal to the Union and they still had slavery. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So he couldn't just free all the slaves, because if he said, well, I free all the slaves with this Emancipation Proclamation, maybe Kentucky joins the South. Maybe Maryland joins the South. Well, I don't know about Delaware, if that was so important. But Missouri, well, by that time, Missouri was pretty much done too. But he didn't just want the border states joining the Southern cause, because that would make the fight even harder. But by 1863, by late 1862 even, he almost didn't care anymore. He had to win this war. And it wasn't easy, and it had to happen. And it had to be total war, because he was going to free the slaves, and he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on the 22nd of September, saying, South, Confederacy, I'll give you 100 days, and then guess what? I'm going to issue a final Emancipation Proclamation, which means we're going to free your slaves now when we conquer your land, if you don't rejoin the Union. If you do, you get to keep your slaves. If you don't, we're going to now free the slaves too. So this expanded the war. But he did it for strategic military reasons. He did it not because it was in the Constitution. He didn't think he had the authority to do it from the Constitution, and he didn't. Because you just couldn't take away property, which unfortunately slaves were considered during peacetime. But he said, this is wartime. So as commander-in-chief, and myself and himself, if I'm Abraham Lincoln, as the president of the United States, I can issue an executive order. I don't even have to go through Congress. I'll write it. An executive order saying, I need all necessary measures to win this military battle, the Civil War, and bring these rebellious states back into the Union. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation referred to. Only slaves in the rebellious states, not in those border states, or states like Tennessee or parts of Louisiana or even Virginia on the coast, where the Union had already conquered those areas. So the slave issue there, it didn't apply to them. It only applied to the rebellious states. So you're going to say, well, then it didn't free anybody. Well, it did in certain areas, but those, we're talking about tens of thousands of people. We're not talking about the 3.5 million enslaved black people who were the slaves in the South. But it took, again, the army, because this was done militarily, to free them. They had to now win. And Abraham Lincoln did it because he thought it gave him a military advantage. And it did, because by freeing the slaves when they're being conquered and writing it on paper and saying we are going to free the slaves, It now keeps Britain and France from recognizing the South as a free and independent country. We're helping them militarily because they had already abolished slavery and they didn't want to be seen as being on that side, on the pro-slavery side. So the North had a moral cause. Also, people didn't want to be drafted into this war by late 62, even after Antietam, which was not necessarily the most decisive battle ever fought. And really, Robert E. Lee was going into Maryland and just went back into Virginia. So he didn't lose any territory in that battle. And it actually was the bloodiest day of the war was in that Antietam battle. But it was after that Abraham Lincoln decided to issue that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation because he had something resembling a victory and wanted to wait until that point. But again, what were the strategic military advantages? So keeping foreign powers out of helping the South was certainly strategic. Number two, as they would conquer more territory, especially in the West that they were doing anyway, they could read the Emancipation Proclamation and say, hey, black slaves, you're now free. We're not going to have you go back to your plantation owners when we defeat them now. You're now free. So they could join the Union Army. That was another advantage, and at least 180,000 black men did join the Union Army and Navy, which helped the North, which had a numerical advantage anyway. But that also hurt the South because it took those people away from them. And it also did something else. The black slaves were a labor force for the Southern war effort. They were growing the crops. They were cooks. They could do a lot of work for the South to free up the white men, to be honest, to fight the war and not make the white men do those jobs. So it took away that advantage of the South, plus the destabilizing effect that it had, which was that as the North would creep closer to certain areas, slaves in those areas would get hint through the grapevine that, hey, slaves are being freed now by the Northern Army. Why don't we run away now and if we can get to where the Northern Army is and escape from our quote masters, right? And though they're not going to return us, they're going to keep us as free people because of the Emancipation Proclamation. And they were right. That is what would happen. So it had all of these effects. And what would happen is, this was now total war. So it was going to be fought that way. And as the North would win territory in the South, and they would, Sherman with his march to the sea, Grant taking Vicksburg, and, eventually winning the whole war, in each area, as they went through it, those slaves were freed. And yes, they didn't get into Texas until actually after the war was already over. So Juneteenth, our now newest national holiday, was set when the Army, because this was done through the Army, really, went to Texas and said, well, Texas, the war is over, and all of your 250,000 slaves are now free, and that's just the way it is. And look, they had to say okay. The Union Army was down there and they had lost. So that's the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. It did free 3.5 million people. Now, eventually, all 4 million slaves in the United States would be freed. Missouri and Maryland did it on their own. They abolished slavery. But it took the 13th Amendment, which went through Congress. It got the 2/3 majority when Lincoln was in office before he was assassinated. But he didn't live to see December 6th happen, when the 3/4 of the states finally ratified the 13th Amendment and all slavery in the United States came to an end in Delaware and Kentucky. Come on, Delaware and Kentucky, you should have done this earlier. But it took the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States to totally outlaw slavery and servitude from ever being allowed in the United States again. And this makes Abraham Lincoln our greatest president of all time. He not only freed the slaves for whatever military reasons he did it, because he had to win the war. It was the deed of doing it by itself, regardless of his reasons, which was so important, because now you not only had 4 million men, women, and children who were enslaved now free, but now their children and their children and their children for the rest of time now would also be free and are free. So that is why I believe Abraham Lincoln is our greatest president. And some people call the Emancipation the second Declaration of Independence. I would call it the most important document written since the United States' inception, since George Washington became the first president of the United States. It's simply that important. Almost religiously important, like Moses freeing the Jews. Lincoln really did free the slaves. That's it for this episode, but check out the episode on the history of voting, and let's see if African Americans in the South, the sneaky South, would allow formerly enslaved people, the black population, to just easily vote, or would it be a struggle? Check that video out too. And remember, history happens every day.